since we're dealing with media this week, no better man to have on the show than Harry Browne. How are you, Harry?
How you doing?
Harry is a journalist, a journalism lecturer in DIT. He's a former journalist. He's an activist, a broadcaster, an author. He knows everything about Irish media, inside out, top and bottom.
You're too kind.
Great to have you on the show.
Great to be here, thanks.
So let's get started. Conservative media or conservative population. I was talking to another journalist today, and she said she feels like we have a conservative population, but which comes forward?
Yeah, I don't agree that we have an especially conservative population in this country. There's some aspects of Irish, I'm originally from the States, some aspects of Irish demographics would lead towards a certain conservatism, you know, the rural background, the high property ownership, etc. But I don't think we're a particularly conservative population. I think Dublin in particular, if you look at the voting patterns in this city, is a pretty red city. I think our media is actually considerably more conservative than the population has shown itself to be at various times. I think the media has very little representation for whole swathes of political opinion, the likes of the United Left Alliance, the people in Dame Street, even Sinn Féin hardly gets a look in. And that has, you know, support of, you know, easily 15 or 20% of the population of the city, and close to that around the country if you look at Martin McGuinness's performance. So I think a conservative media much more than a conservative country.
Journalists are always insist that you know, no one dictates their story or their, you know, cover or whatever. So with media seemingly being owned by very few people in this country, does does ownership influence what goes out, what journalists put out?
The journalists who say that are by and large being quite honest. They don't experience on a daily basis interference from their owners by and large. What actually happens though is that you come to, if you like, interiorize the interests of your owners and start to think of them as natural, as common sense. Sure, you know, obviously, what we have quite interesting in independent newspapers at the moment is on the one hand, Tony O'Reilly is still the controlling shareholder. On the other hand, Dennis O'Brien is a major shareholder as well. And the journalists in those papers don't quite know which way to turn in relation to that. So their usual thing where they start to feel in the Independent for many years that Tony O'Reilly's interests were also the best interests of the country, so therefore it was no problem to serve them.
Yeah.
They've got this other interest that's competing with it. So we're at an interesting moment, but for the most part journalists operate in the interests of their owners because they think that that's the correct thing to do, not even on a kind of a self-interested basis, but on the basis that of common sense.
Yeah.
They learn to censor themselves so that they don't even know that they're censoring themselves.
Yeah. So someone who doesn't seem to censor themselves is Eamon Dunphy,
yeah,
who last weekend seemed to lay into Dennis O'Brien. So is it only someone like Dunphy in the last week of a show and at the age that he is, whatever, that he can do that, or, you know, what?
Yeah, I mean, Dunphy is a loose cannon, has been in many ways for a long time, and has been all over the place politically. He's not necessarily someone that you can always trust to take up the cudgels on behalf of righteousness, but in this case he could, and you're right, it's exactly that freedom. He's in the last week of his show. He had a falling out anyway with News Talk over his contract. And he could tell a lot of really pertinent truths about what the experience of working in that station is like, for one thing, about the casualization, the poor pay, the high turnover. Those are really important, and I think that his colleagues in News Talk would have quietly appreciated having their concerns raised in that way. But people like Dunphy, people to a certain extent like me, I'm employed by the DIT, I can come on your show and go on any show I like and talk about, if I'm asked, and talk about media in ways that if I were still working in the Irish Times, I probably wouldn't be able to do so. I wouldn't feel quite as free. So,
Harry, the Occupy movement has sprung up all across the world, and their slogan is "Be Your Own Media." Is that realistic, or do we underestimate the reach of traditional media?
Traditional media still have a huge reach, but they are in a massive crisis, and I think maybe the general population doesn't realize how close we are to the end of newspapers as we know them, for instance. So I think it's not only politically expedient to be your own media, I think it is actually the forward-looking thing to do. Traditional journalism is in big trouble.
So just in terms of then having a national debate on media, you know, how might we start that process, or has it already started?
Well, I think the national debate on media has started, and it's part of the national debate about the way we organize society that's happening, the global debate. And I think to separate media and to pretend that you can talk about media ownership without talking about other ownership of means of communication and production, to talk about other cultural forms of power, I think would be naive. I think that the conversation about media is part of the general conversation about power, and it's a conversation that we're starting to have.
Great. Harry, it's been great having you in. I've learned something here. Hopefully the people have. And it's, I felt bringing someone like you in, I would have been a little bit daunted or whatever, but you're a sound bloke
right.
and you speak a language that I can understand.
Oh,
so Harry, thanks very much.
Thanks, Dean. It's a pleasure.
Now, we've had one journalist in, now let's take the piss out of journalism.